There is a particular kind of horror that does not scream. It whispers. It sits beside you in silence, looks you in the eyes, and waits for you to decide whether it deserves to live. No, I'm Not a Human is not interested in monsters with claws or grotesque forms. Its terror is quieter, colder, and infinitely more unsettling. It asks a simple question, repeated until it loses meaning. How do you know someone is human? In this game, fear is not born from what chases you, but from what stands still in front of you. Faces almost right, voices almost warm, stories that almost make sense. The horror emerges in the hesitation, in the pause before judgment, in the realization that empathy itself has become a liability. This is psychological horror stripped of spectacle and reduced to its most painful core, suspicion. The kind that corrodes trust, fractures identity, and slowly turns survival into cruelty. By the time the game ends, the question is no longer who is human, but whether you still are. Welcome. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? What part of the world are you in right now? Horror changes shape depending on where we stand, and this game understands that better than most. Have you already played No, I'm Not a Human? Or is this your first encounter with its unsettling world? Let me know in the comments, because your experience matters here. This is not a game that offers universal answers. It reflects the player back at themselves. If you enjoy deep psychological horror analysis, narrative-driven games, and explorations of fear that linger long after the screen goes dark, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like if you want more content that dissects games not just as entertainment, but as mirrors of our inner world. No, I'm Not a Human places us in a collapsing society where alien entities called visitors imitate humans almost perfectly. The player is tasked with identifying subtle differences, behavioral slips, emotional inconsistencies. On the surface, it is a game about observation and deduction. Beneath that, it is a study of dehumanization. This analysis will explore how the game constructs paranoia, how it weaponizes empathy, and how it slowly teaches the player to see people not as individuals, but as potential threats. We will examine how fear reshapes morality, how survival erodes compassion, and how the game echoes the emotional emptiness found in the song I'm Not Human at All by Sleep Party People. This is not just a game analysis, it is an autopsy of humanity under pressure. Paranoia in No, I'm Not a Human is not accidental. It is not an emotional byproduct or a side effect of horror aesthetics. It is carefully engineered, methodical, and deeply intentional. From the very first moments, the game constructs a reality where certainty does not exist, only probabilities. Truth is never absolute, only estimated. Every interaction becomes a test, every conversation a potential trap, every pause a possible mistake that cannot be undone. The environment itself conspires against clarity. Dim lighting obscures details rather than revealing them. Enclosed spaces compress the player's field of vision, creating a sensation of entrapment rather than protection. Repetitive routines blur the perception of time, transforming days into indistinguishable cycles of suspicion. The world feels stagnant, yet tense, as if reality itself is holding its breath. This is not a place where answers are discovered. It is a place where doubt accumulates. The visitors are terrifying, not because they are overtly hostile, but because they are almost correct. They occupy the unsettling space between human and imitation. They speak like humans, not fluently perfect, but convincingly imperfect. They remember fragments of human life, names, habits, emotional references that suggest history without fully embodying it. They express emotions that feel rehearsed, but rehearsed well enough to provoke hesitation, a smile that lasts a second too long, a sorrow that appears at the wrong moment. These are not errors that scream danger. They whisper uncertainty. The game understands a fundamental truth of psychological horror. Fear intensifies when the threat is ambiguous. Clear danger allows action. A monster lunging from the dark demands response. A visible enemy creates a sense of moral clarity. Unclear danger does the opposite. It immobilizes. It forces reflection where instinct should be. It replaces reaction with rumination. In No, I'm Not a Human, the absence of certainty becomes the true antagonist. As the player, you are constantly scanning for signs. Too much eye contact, too little emotion, a delay before answering a question, a story that feels memorized rather than lived. At first, these details feel subtle, almost trivial. You question whether you are imagining them, but over time, these signs stop being anomalies and become obsessions. You replay conversations in your mind. You doubt your own memory. You wonder if you missed something obvious, or if you are inventing danger to justify your fear. Gradually, interaction transforms into analysis. You are no longer speaking to people, you are dissecting them. Tone, posture, timing, all become data points. Humanity becomes a checklist rather than a lived experience. This shift is slow, almost imperceptible, which is precisely why it is effective. The game never announces that you are losing empathy. It allows you to drift away from it naturally. This constant vigilance creates psychological exhaustion. The mind was not designed to sustain perpetual suspicion. The player feels this fatigue not through explicit mechanics, but through emotional weight. The game does not punish mistakes immediately. Instead, it allows uncertainty to linger. Consequences are delayed, ambiguous, unresolved. You are left alone with your thoughts. Was that person human? Did you just kill someone who trusted you? Or did you save yourself from something far worse? The game refuses to answer these questions. It offers no confirmation, no reassurance, no closure. Doubt becomes permanent, and that permanence is crushing. Paranoia becomes the atmosphere you breathe. It is no longer a reaction to danger, but the default state of existence. The world narrows. Your focus tightens. Peripheral details fade away. Moral frameworks begin to dissolve, not because you consciously reject them, but because they become impractical. Compassion requires trust, and trust feels lethal. The only thing that matters is control, because control feels like safety. The illusion of certainty becomes more comforting than truth itself. Making a decision, any decision, feels better than remaining suspended in doubt. In this way, paranoia does not merely frighten the player, it reshapes them. The brilliance of No, I'm Not a Human lies in how it transforms fear into habit. At first, paranoia feels intrusive, like an unwanted guest. Later, it feels necessary. Eventually, it feels normal. The player begins to internalize the logic of suspicion. If something feels slightly off, it must be dangerous. If someone cannot prove their humanity perfectly, they must not deserve it. This is where the game crosses from horror into commentary. Paranoia stops being about survival and starts being about identity. The player's sense of self becomes entangled with the act of judgment. You are no longer asking, "Who is human?" You are asking, "What kind of person am I becoming by asking this question?" The game offers no relief from this introspection. There are no safe spaces, no moments of emotional release. Even quiet scenes feel tense, loaded with implication. Silence becomes suspect. Calm becomes threatening. Peace feels like a lie waiting to collapse. What makes this paranoia especially devastating is how relatable it is. The game does not rely on fantastical fears. It reflects real psychological processes. In times of crisis, people search for signs. They categorize. They simplify. They reduce complex individuals into symbols of safety or danger. No, I'm Not a Human captures this process with unsettling precision. The longer you play, the harder it becomes to remember what genuine connection feels like. Every interaction carries an invisible weight. Even moments that should feel human, shared memories, emotional vulnerability, feel like potential manipulation. The game teaches you, subtly and cruelly, that caring is a risk. And yet, despite all this, the paranoia never fully resolves. It never reaches a satisfying conclusion. There is no moment where the system proves itself correct. The player is never told that their suspicions saved the world. Instead, they are left with the quiet aftermath of their decisions, surrounded by absence rather than victory. This unresolved tension is the core of the game's psychological horror. Paranoia does not end when the threat is eliminated. It ends when trust is restored, and "No, I'm not a human" offers no such restoration. By design, it denies the player the comfort of moral certainty. In the end, paranoia is not portrayed as madness, but as adaptation, a response to an environment that punishes openness and rewards suspicion. This framing is deeply unsettling because it suggests that under the right conditions, paranoia is not irrational, it is logical. The true horror, then, is not that the player becomes paranoid. It is that the game makes paranoia feel reasonable. And once paranoia becomes reasonable, humanity becomes negotiable. One of the most unsettling aspects of "No, I'm not a human" is how dehumanization is not merely a narrative theme, but an active gameplay mechanic. It is not something discussed in dialogue or implied through lore alone. It is something the player performs, repeatedly, until it becomes instinct. The game does not ask you to understand dehumanization. It asks you to practice it, slowly, deliberately, and without ceremony. From the beginning, the game trains you to stop seeing individuals and start seeing patterns. Faces lose their uniqueness. Distinct features blur together. Voices stop carrying personality and begin to function as signals. Tone, cadence, pauses, all are stripped of emotional meaning and reduced to indicators. A human presence is no longer a person. It is a puzzle to be solved. This transformation is subtle. At first, the player still listens, still hesitates, still considers backstories and emotional cues. But the mechanics quietly discourage this behavior. Emotional engagement complicates decision-making. Caring introduces doubt. Doubt increases risk. Over time, the most efficient way to survive is to detach. The act of identification requires emotional distance. To judge whether someone is human, you must observe them without empathy. Empathy becomes dangerous. If you listen too closely, if you allow their fear, their hope, or their vulnerability to affect you, you risk making the wrong choice. The game does not punish compassion directly, but it associates compassion with failure. Slowly, the player learns that emotional numbness is safer. This process mirrors real-world mechanisms of dehumanization with unsettling accuracy. When fear dominates a society, people stop being people and start becoming categories. They are no longer individuals with histories and contradictions. They become threats, numbers, risks, variables to be managed. Language changes, perception narrows, moral nuance disappears. The game forces the player into this mindset not by instructing them to abandon empathy, but by making empathy feel irresponsible. Caring becomes a liability. Kindness becomes a flaw. The game reframes moral warmth as weakness, and in doing so, it reveals how easily ethical frameworks can be rewritten under pressure. Each decision reinforces the idea that humanity is something that can be measured, verified, proven. Humanity becomes conditional. It is no longer an inherent state, but a status that must be earned through correct behavior. If someone fails to perform humanity properly, if they hesitate, if they respond incorrectly, if they feel wrong at the wrong moment, then their humanity is revoked, and if it cannot be proven, it is expendable. This is one of the most chilling ideas the game presents. Humanity is not lost through malice, but through protocol, through systems, through checklists. The player is not encouraged to hate the visitors. In fact, hatred would require emotional investment. Instead, the player is encouraged to process them. By turning judgment into routine, the game normalizes cruelty. Killing does not feel like violence, it feels like procedure. There is no dramatic buildup, no cinematic emphasis on the act itself. It is quick, functional, almost mundane. This lack of spectacle is intentional. Violence loses its weight when it becomes habitual. This is where the horror truly lies, not in what the player does, but in how natural it begins to feel. The first time you make a lethal decision, it carries tension. The second time, it carries doubt. The 10th time, it carries efficiency. The game charts this emotional erosion with quiet precision. As the player adapts to the mechanics, they unknowingly adopt the game's moral logic. You stop asking whether it is right to judge someone's humanity. You start asking how well you judged it. Success is defined not by ethical integrity, but by survival and correctness. This shift is deeply uncomfortable because it implicates the player directly. The game does not position dehumanization as something done by villains or abstract systems. It is something you do with your own hands, your own choices, your own reasoning. The most disturbing aspect is how reasonable it feels. The game presents a world where hesitation leads to death, where mistakes have irreversible consequences. In such a context, emotional distance feels justified. The player begins to rationalize their behavior. This is necessary. This is survival. This is not cruelty, it is logic. But logic stripped of empathy becomes something else entirely. The longer the game continues, the more humanity feels like an inconvenience. Individuality complicates categorization. Personal stories slow down judgment. Emotional reactions introduce unpredictability. The game teaches you subtly but firmly that smooth systems require flat people. This is reflected in how the player's perception changes. Early in the game, characters feel distinct. Later, they blend together. The mind stops recording names and faces. What matters is compliance with the expected pattern. The game does not just depict dehumanization, it induces it. This induced mindset is what makes the experience linger after the game ends. You realize that the system worked, not just on the characters, but on you. You became comfortable with decisions that, outside the game, would be unthinkable. And you did so without being coerced. The game never forces you to enjoy cruelty. It simply removes the emotional barriers that prevent it. In this way, "No, I'm not a human" exposes a frightening truth. Dehumanization does not require hatred. It requires distance. It requires fear. It requires systems that reward efficiency over compassion. Once those conditions are met, cruelty becomes procedural. The horror is not that the player kills. The horror is that the player stops feeling that killing is a moral rupture. It becomes another step in a process. Another checkbox completed. Another problem solved. By the end, the player is left with an unsettling realization. The greatest transformation did not happen to the world of the game. It happened internally. The game did not ask you to abandon your humanity outright. It simply taught you how easy it is to set it aside. And once humanity becomes optional, it becomes fragile. That fragility is the true legacy of "No, I'm not a human." Not fear of the visitors, but fear of how quickly the line between human and non-human can dissolve, not because of monsters, but because of systems that make forgetting easier than caring. As the game progresses, the boundary between human and visitor begins to blur, not only externally in the faces you study and the voices you interrogate, but internally, in the quiet space where your own thoughts reside. The player starts to question their reactions, their instincts, and their moral reflexes. Am I becoming like them, or was I always capable of this? The game never answers this question, because the uncertainty itself is the point. At first, the distinction feels clear. Humans hesitate. Humans doubt. Humans feel. Visitors imitate. They perform. They approximate. But as the hours pass, these definitions erode. The player notices that their own behavior is changing. Hesitation becomes inefficient. Doubt becomes dangerous. Emotional response becomes something to suppress rather than trust. The player begins to act with the same calculated restraint they once associated with the visitors. The title itself, "No, I'm not a human," slowly turns inward. What initially sounds like a defensive statement, a denial spoken by something trying to pass, becomes an internal echo. It stops referring exclusively to the visitors and starts resonating inside the player's own mind. Each decision reinforces this echo, quieter each time, yet more convincing. The emotional detachment required to survive feels alien at first, like wearing a mask that does not quite fit. Over time, that mask begins to feel natural. Familiar moral instincts fade, not because they are challenged directly, but because they are no longer useful. Compassion slows you down. Guilt introduces hesitation. Mercy creates risk. The game does not argue against these values. It simply places the player in a context where these values cannot thrive. In doing so, it reveals how dependent morality is on environment. This erosion of identity is subtle. There is no dramatic transformation. No cinematic moment of self-realization. Instead, there is a quiet shift. Decisions become easier. Hesitation disappears. Guilt fades into practicality. What once felt heavy becomes routine. The player does not notice the moment they change, because change is framed as adaptation. This subtlety is what makes the experience unsettling. Identity is not stripped away violently. It is negotiated, compromised, slowly redefined. The player still believes they are acting rationally, even ethically, within the logic of the world. But that logic has narrowed. Humanity has been reduced to function. The game suggests that humanity is not a fixed state, but a fragile performance. It is something maintained only under conditions of safety, trust, and mutual recognition. When those conditions collapse, humanity collapses with them. The player does not lose their humanity because they are weak. They lose it because the world no longer supports it. This perspective reframes dehumanization as a systemic failure, rather than a personal flaw. The player is not portrayed as cruel or malicious. They are portrayed as responsive. They adapt to a reality that punishes vulnerability and rewards detachment. The game implies that anyone placed in these conditions would follow a similar path. As the line between human and visitor dissolves, the player is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The differences they once relied on are no longer reliable. The visitors feel more human as the player feels less so. The question shifts from who is human to what does being human even mean in this context. This internal collapse mirrors the melancholic themes of "I'm Not Human at All" by Sleep Party People. The song captures emotional disconnection, numbness, and alienation, not as something imposed from outside, but as something that grows internally, quietly, almost invisibly. It speaks of a self that no longer recognizes its own emotional landscape. In both the game and the music, the loss of humanity is not loud, it is lonely. There is no explosion, no scream, no dramatic farewell to who you once were. There is only distance. Distance from others. Distance from yourself. The song's slow, aching rhythm mirrors the pacing of the game. Both create space for introspection rather than shock. They allow emptiness to settle. The absence of strong emotion becomes the defining feeling. You are not overwhelmed, you are hollowed out. This hollowness is what lingers after the game ends. The player is left with memories of decisions that felt necessary, but now feel unsettling in retrospect. Without the immediate pressure of survival, the player begins to question their actions. Was that really me? Or was that someone shaped by fear? The game never offers a clean separation between the player and the character. There is no narrative device that absolves the player of responsibility. The choices were yours. The reasoning was yours. The detachment was learned, but it was learned willingly. This is where the game becomes deeply introspective. It forces the player to confront the idea that identity is situational, that under enough pressure, the self we recognize can dissolve, that the line between human and non-human is not as stable as we would like to believe. The phrase "I'm not a human" transforms from a lie spoken by an outsider into a confession whispered internally, not because the player has become something monstrous, but because they have adapted too well. They have learned to function without feeling. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the game. It does not suggest that humanity is lost through evil. It suggests that humanity is lost through necessity, through systems that make empathy incompatible with survival. By the end, the player is not terrified of the visitors. They are terrified of the realization that the visitors were never the true threat. The true threat was the environment that made humanity optional. In this way, "No, I'm not a human" becomes a meditation on identity under pressure. It asks whether humanity is something we are or something we do. And if it is something we do, what happens when the world makes doing it impossible? The answer the game offers is quiet and devastating. Humanity does not disappear in a single moment. It erodes, slowly, silently, until one day you realize that the voice saying, "I'm not a human," no longer sounds foreign at all. No, "I'm not a human" does not depict societal collapse through chaos, fire, or spectacle. It does not rely on riots, explosions, or screaming crowds. Instead, it presents collapse through order. Systems remain intact. Procedures continue to function. Rules are enforced with precision and consistency. Offices still operate. Protocols are followed. Authority is not overthrown. It is normalized. And that is precisely what makes the world of the game so terrifying. In this society, nothing appears broken on the surface. There is structure, there is routine, there is logic. Yet, beneath this controlled exterior, something essential has been hollowed out. The game suggests that collapse does not always arrive as destruction. Sometimes it arrives as efficiency. Sometimes it arrives as organization stripped of meaning. Fear is the engine that powers this transformation. It restructures society into something clean, functional, and deeply inhuman. Trust is no longer a social value. It is a liability. In its place comes verification, proof, documentation, behavioral analysis. Every interaction must be justified, monitored, and confirmed. The assumption of shared humanity disappears. Community, once built on mutual recognition and emotional bonds, is replaced by surveillance. People do not look out for one another, they observe one another. Presence becomes suspicious. Proximity becomes risk. Social space is no longer a place of connection, but a field of potential threats. The simple act of existing near someone else becomes a silent test. Survival in this world becomes bureaucratic. Life and death decisions are reduced to forms, criteria, and procedures. The act of judgment is no longer personal, it is administrative. This distance is crucial. Bureaucracy allows cruelty to operate without emotion. It transforms moral choices into tasks to be completed. The game implies that the true infection is not the visitors themselves, but the mindset they create. The visitors may be the catalyst, but the real danger lies in how society responds. Fear spreads faster than any alien entity. It rewrites values. It reframes ethics. It teaches people that safety requires exclusion. A society that treats humanity as conditional cannot survive intact. It can only persist as a shell. The outer structure remains, laws, systems, routines, but the internal substance is gone. Empathy becomes rare, compliance becomes virtue, silence becomes survival. The game never portrays this transformation as sudden. There is no single moment where society crosses a clear line. Instead, there is gradual adaptation. Each new rule feels reasonable, each restriction feels justified, each loss of freedom is explained as necessary. This incremental erosion is what makes the collapse believable. This portrayal reflects historical and contemporary realities with unsettling clarity. Throughout history, moments of collective fear have led societies to accept inhumane measures in the name of security. Surveillance is expanded, rights are suspended, certain groups are treated as inherently suspicious. These actions are rarely framed as cruelty. They are framed as protection. The game forces the player to participate in this logic. You are not an observer of societal collapse. You are an operator within it. You enforce rules. You apply criteria. You decide who belongs and who does not. In doing so, the game makes you complicit. This complicity is key. The game does not allow the player to occupy a morally superior position. There is no option to reject the system outright. No path of pure resistance. You must work within the structure provided. You must make decisions using its language and its assumptions. There is no rebellion, no heroic resistance, no dramatic uprising against authority. Just compliance. Just people doing their jobs. Just procedures being followed. And that is perhaps the most honest portrayal of collapse. The absence of rebellion is not a flaw in the narrative. It is a statement. The game suggests that most societal collapses do not happen because people suddenly become evil. They happen because people adapt. They follow rules. They accept systems that promise safety, even when those systems erode fundamental values. In No, I'm Not a Human, authority is faceless. Orders are not barked by tyrants. They are embedded in process. This makes resistance difficult because there is no single villain to oppose. The system functions smoothly. It rewards obedience. It punishes deviation. The player feels this pressure constantly. Acting outside protocol feels dangerous, not just morally, but practically. The game conditions you to believe that the system exists for a reason, that questioning it is irresponsible, that trust is naive. Over time, the system shapes perception itself. The player stops seeing individuals and starts seeing cases, files, assessments, risks. This mirrors how large-scale systems dehumanize without explicit malice. When people become data, empathy becomes inefficient. The game also highlights how order can be more frightening than chaos. Chaos is unpredictable, but it is honest. Order hides its violence behind procedure. It allows harm to be distributed quietly, consistently, without emotional disturbance. By presenting collapse through order, the game challenges common narratives about dystopia. There is no dramatic fall, no apocalyptic event. Society does not explode, it tightens. It becomes more controlled, more monitored, more precise, and in doing so, it loses its soul. The most unsettling aspect is how familiar this world feels. The logic is recognizable. The language is familiar. The justifications are convincing. The game does not ask you to imagine an alien society. It asks you to recognize your own. By the end, the player is left with a disturbing realization. The system did not fail. It succeeded. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It maintained order. It minimized risk. It ensured survival. But in achieving these goals, it transformed humanity into something conditional and disposable. This is the core horror of No, I'm Not a Human. Not invasion, not monsters, but the realization that a society can function perfectly while losing everything that once made it worth preserving. The game does not offer solutions. It does not propose rebellion or redemption. It simply holds up a mirror and asks a devastating question. If this system works, what does that say about us? In portraying collapse through compliance, the game delivers its most haunting message. The end of humanity does not require destruction. It only requires fear, organization, and the willingness to follow rules without asking what they cost. And perhaps that is why this depiction lingers, because it does not feel like fiction. It feels like a warning whispered through procedure, reminding us that the most dangerous societies are not the ones that fall apart, but the ones that keep working long after their humanity is gone. Unlike traditional horror games, No, I'm Not a Human offers no catharsis. There is no final monster waiting to be defeated. No climactic confrontation that promises relief, no triumphant escape that restores a sense of safety. The structure itself resists resolution. The horror does not end. It stabilizes. It settles into place like a new normal, quietly asserting that this is simply how things are now. In most horror narratives, fear is a journey with an endpoint. You survive the night. You defeat the threat. You escape the house, the town, the nightmare. Even when the ending is bleak, there is often a sense of narrative closure, a moment where the tension breaks. No, I'm Not a Human denies this release entirely. It refuses to let fear burn out. Instead, it teaches fear to endure. By the time the game reaches its conclusion, the player is not relieved. There is no emotional exhale. Instead, there is a lingering stillness, heavy and unresolved. The game leaves behind a quiet discomfort, a sensation that something has been altered in the player's perception. The screen goes dark, but the experience does not recede. It follows you beyond the screen, into reflection, into memory. The most unsettling aspect is that nothing explicitly terrible happens at the end. There is no shocking twist that recontextualizes everything. The ending feels almost mundane, and that mundanity is deliberate. The horror has become embedded. It no longer needs spectacle. The player is left alone with a question that refuses to fade. Would you make the same choices again? Not under different circumstances, not with more information, but exactly as you are now, knowing what you know. And if you would, what does that say about you? This question is not rhetorical. It is accusatory without accusation. The game does not condemn the player. It does not frame their actions as evil or wrong. It simply presents them back to you, stripped of urgency, stripped of justification, and asks you to sit with them. This is psychological horror at its most effective. It does not traumatize through shock or gore or sudden violence. It traumatizes through recognition. You recognize yourself in the decisions you made. You recognize your reasoning, your rationalizations, your compromises. And that recognition is deeply unsettling. The game's power lies in how ordinary your choices felt at the time. You were not acting out of malice. You were acting out of necessity. You were responding to a system that rewarded caution and punished empathy. In that context, your actions made sense. That is precisely why they are so difficult to confront afterward. In reflecting on the experience, the player begins to notice how easily they adapted, how quickly the rules of the world became acceptable, how natural it felt to prioritize efficiency over compassion. The game does not need to tell you that something is wrong. You feel it in the aftermath. Unlike many horror games that externalize fear through monsters or curses, "No, I'm not a human" internalizes it. The true source of discomfort is not something you escaped from, but something you carried with you. The game suggests that fear does not always need an external object. Sometimes it only needs a system and a role. The lack of catharsis also reflects the game's thematic focus on dehumanization. Catharsis implies emotional release, a return to balance. But dehumanization does not resolve cleanly. Once empathy is eroded, once moral frameworks are compromised, they do not simply snap back into place. The game understands this, and so it denies the player a clean ending. Instead, it leaves behind residue, a sense of moral dissonance, a feeling that something essential was traded away for survival. The player may not even be able to articulate what was lost, only that it mattered. This lingering discomfort is amplified by the game's refusal to assign blame. There is no villain to point to, no singular moment where everything went wrong. The system functioned, the choices were logical, the outcome was predictable, and that is what makes it so disturbing. The game does not accuse, it reflects. It reflects the player's capacity for adaptation, their willingness to comply, their ability to justify actions within a given framework. It reflects how quickly morality can become conditional when survival is at stake. It reflects how systems shape behavior more effectively than ideology ever could. This reflection is not cruel. It is quiet. The game does not shout its message. It trusts the player to discover it on their own. This trust is what makes the experience resonate. You are not being lectured. You are being shown yourself. Over time, the memory of the game shifts. Specific scenes fade. Individual characters blur. What remains is a feeling, a question, a discomfort that resurfaces unexpectedly, in moments of real-world uncertainty, in situations that demand judgment, in times when fear threatens to override empathy. The player may find themselves thinking back to the game, not as a story, but as a state of mind. A reminder of how easily roles can reshape values, how fragile humanity can be under pressure. This is the lasting impact of "No, I'm not a human." It does not aim to entertain fear, it aims to embed it. It transforms horror from an experience you endure into a perspective you carry. By refusing catharsis, the game denies the player emotional escape. It insists that the consequences of their actions remain unresolved. That reflection cannot be postponed. That discomfort must be acknowledged. In doing so, the game achieves something rare. It does not simply scare the player. It unsettles their sense of self. It challenges the comforting belief that we would always act humanely, that our values are immutable, that our compassion is guaranteed. The final horror is not what the game shows you. It is what it reveals about you. And long after the game ends, that revelation lingers, quiet, persistent, uncomfortable, waiting to be recognized again. That is the true ending of "No, I'm not a human." Not a conclusion, but a question that refuses to let you go. So what does "No, I'm not a human" teach us? What does it say about fear, about empathy, about the fragile agreements that hold society together? How does this apply to the real world, where suspicion often replaces understanding and safety is used to justify cruelty? This game reminds us that dehumanization does not begin with hatred. It begins with fear, with the belief that survival requires distance. that empathy is optional. And perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson is this: under the right conditions, most of us are capable of becoming something unrecognizable. Now I want to hear from you. What did this game make you feel? Did it change how you think about humanity, about trust, about yourself? Comment your experience below. Share your interpretation. And if this analysis resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join the conversation. Because the real horror does not end when the game is over. It begins when we recognize ourselves in it.